Let's get right into it. Number 12. You have no idea why you did that. Picture this. You just bought a $47 scented candle that smells like library rain. You didn't need it. You weren't even shopping for candles. And yet, here you are, credit card receipt in hand, already thinking up a completely reasonable-sounding justification for why this was actually a smart purchase. Stress relief, ambience, investment in your well-being. Sure. Here's the thing your brain doesn't want you to know. You almost never make a decision before you make a decision. The choice happens first, fast, automatic, deep in the part of your brain that also handles hunger and mild panic. And then the logical, language-using part of your brain wakes up, looks around, and starts writing the press release. Psychologists call this post-hoc rationalization, and it's not something that happens to you occasionally. It is, functionally, your default operating mode. There's a classic split-brain experiment where researchers surgically separated the two hemispheres of patients' brains. Then they'd show an instruction like, go for a walk, only to the side of the brain that can't speak. The patient would stand up and start walking. When asked why, the speaking half of the brain, which genuinely had no idea, would confidently make something up. I wanted to stretch. I felt like getting some water. Your brain did not say, let me think about this. It said, I've already decided, now here's your story. So the next time you feel absolutely certain about why you did something, why you sent that text, why you took that job, why you bought the candle, understand that what you're hearing is the PR department, not the boardroom. Basically, you're not the CEO of your own mind. You're the spokesperson. Number 11. Your confidence is probably backwards. Some people walk into rooms like they own them. Loud, certain, ready to share their opinion on topics they mildly Googled 3 weeks ago. And some people sit quietly in the corner, second-guessing every thought before it reaches their mouth, terrified they'll say something wrong. Here's the uncomfortable part. Statistically, those two groups have it completely inverted. In 1999, psychologists David Dunning and Justin-Kruger ran a now-famous study showing that people with low competence in a subject dramatically overestimate their ability, while people who are actually skilled tend to underestimate themselves. The reason is almost elegant in how cruel it is. To know what you don't know, you first need to know enough to recognize the gap. Beginners don't have that map yet, so they just assume the map is small. Think about the first time you tried to cook something complicated. You probably thought, how hard can this be? And then you ruined it. And then you started to understand how much you didn't know. That creeping awareness of complexity, that's actually a sign of growth. Feeling dumb sometimes means you're getting smarter. Meanwhile, the guy in the meeting who has a take on everything, quantum physics, macroeconomics, why the company's marketing strategy is fundamentally broken, has often done just enough reading to feel fluent and not nearly enough to feel lost. Your brain rewards certainty. Feels good. Doubt is uncomfortable. So your brain often skips the uncomfortable part and hands you confidence like a participation trophy, regardless of whether you've actually earned it. The weird silver lining? If you're the type of person who constantly worries they're not smart enough, that's actually a decent signal. Intellectually humble people tend to be more accurate, more open to feedback, and better at actually solving problems. The most dangerous person in any room is the one who's never once thought, wait, am I wrong about this? Number 10. Your brain actively rewrites the past. Quick test. Think about a memory from your childhood. Something specific, a birthday, a holiday, a weird afternoon that just stuck. Got it? Now consider this. That memory has been edited. Multiple times. Possibly by you, without your knowledge, every single time you've thought about it. Human memory is not a video file. It's not stored cleanly on a server somewhere, waiting to be played back intact. Memory is reconstructive, meaning every time you remember something, you're essentially rebuilding it from fragments, and in the process, you're vulnerable to contaminating it with your current mood, things you've heard since, how the story has been retold, and what you wish had happened. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus spent decades demonstrating just how disturbingly editable memory is. In one set of studies, she convinced a significant portion of participants that they had been lost in a shopping mall as a child, an event that never actually happened. Not just vague agreement either. People recalled details. The color of the store, being scared, a kind stranger, completely fabricated, and completely believed. This isn't a flaw reserved for people with bad memories. It affects everyone. The confident storyteller at dinner who swears they remember exactly how something went. Their brain has been doing quiet renovations on that memory for years. The version they're telling you is the most recent edit, not the original draft. The legal system has slowly, painfully come to terms with this. Eyewitness testimony, once considered the gold standard of evidence, is now understood to be deeply, structurally unreliable. People don't lie on purpose. Their memory just lies for them. So the next time you're absolutely certain you remember something exactly right and someone contradicts you, sit with that for a moment. Not because you're necessarily wrong, but because I'm certain and I'm accurate are two things your brain treats as synonyms and really genuinely are not. Number 9. You are deeply, embarrassingly predictable. You think of yourself as an individual, a complex, layered, unpredictable human being with a unique inner life and a set of opinions you arrived at through careful, independent thought. And look, that's a lovely story. But researchers who study human behavior have some news for you, and it is not flattering. Given enough data points, your age, your zip code, your media consumption, your purchasing history, the 5 personality trait psychologists use to map virtually all of human character algorithms can predict your choices, your political leanings, your relationship outcomes, and your likelihood of quitting a job with accuracy that should make you sit down quietly and stare at a wall. The famous Cambridge Analytica scandal wasn't just a privacy horror story. It was a demonstration of something psychologists had already known for years. People are far more patterned than they believe. A model trained on your Facebook likes, not your posts, not your messages, just the things you casually clicked, could predict your personality more accurately than your coworkers, more accurately than your friends. In some studies, more accurately than your family members. And here's the layer that really stings. One of the most consistent predictors of being manipulated by a targeted message is believing you're too smart to be manipulated by a targeted message. The people who say, "I don't fall for that stuff," are statistically not more resistant to it. They're just less aware of when it's working. Your brain is running on heuristics, mental shortcuts built from evolutionary pressure and lived experience. And those shortcuts are not random. They're patterned, predictably patterned. The sense of spontaneity you feel when you make a choice is, a lot of the time, the subjective experience of a very old script running on autopilot. Which doesn't mean free will is dead and nothing matters. It means self-awareness is one of the only actual tools you have. You can't escape the pattern if you don't know the pattern exists. Number 8. You don't actually have an attention span, you have a threat detector. Everyone blames phones for destroying their concentration. And sure, phones are not helping. But the attention crisis people keep lamenting isn't new, and it isn't really about devices. It's about what your brain was actually built to do, which is emphatically not read a 400-page novel in one sitting. Your attention system evolved under conditions where staying hyper-focused on one thing for extended periods was, in most cases, a fantastic way to get eaten. The brain that survived was the one that kept scanning, kept checking, noticed the rustle in the bushes, got bored of the safe thing and looked around for threats. Novelty and movement captured attention because novelty and movement used to mean danger or food, two things worth prioritizing. Fast forward to now, and you've handed that ancient threat detection system a smartphone with infinite scroll, a notification system engineered by some of the world's best behavioral scientists, and a culture that produces more content per minute than you could consume in 1,000 lifetimes. And then you're surprised you can't focus on your spreadsheet. Psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying what he called flow, the state of deep, effortless concentration people sometimes enter when a task is challenging enough to be engaging, but not so hard it's overwhelming. The interesting finding wasn't just that flow feels great. It's how rare the conditions for it actually are. Your brain needs a very specific cocktail, clear goals, immediate feedback, just the right level of difficulty, to lock in fully. Most of the modern work environment provides none of these things. So when you sit down to focus and your brain immediately wanders to what you're having for dinner, that's not a character flaw. That's a system doing what it was designed to do, in an environment it was never designed for. The real skill isn't having a long attention span. It's learning how to temporarily convince a paranoid security guard to stop patrolling for 20 minutes. Number 7, your emotions decide first, then invite logic to the meeting. There's a version of yourself you probably believe in: calm, rational, evidence-based, the kind of person who changes their mind when presented with good arguments. And maybe sometimes you are that person. But neuroscience would like to gently file a formal objection. Antonio Damasio, a neurologist at USC, spent years studying patients with damage to the parts of the brain that process emotion. On paper, these patients seemed like they'd be better decision-makers, no messy feelings clouding their judgment, just pure logic. What actually happened was the opposite. They became functionally unable to make decisions at all. They could analyze every option endlessly, list pros and cons forever, and still not choose what to have for lunch. It turns out emotion isn't the enemy of good thinking. It's the engine of it. Feelings act as a fast prioritization system. They tag certain options as appealing or repulsive before your slow, deliberate reasoning even shows up to the table. Without that tagging system, nothing gets done. The problem is that the emotional system is fast and opinionated, and it doesn't particularly care whether its opinions are accurate. You can feel disgusted by a completely harmless thing, and that disgust will color how you evaluate every logical argument about it. You can feel warmly toward a stranger who reminds you of someone you like, and suddenly their ideas seem more credible. Your brain calls this intuition. Researchers call it affective bias. The difference is mostly branding. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist, described moral reasoning as a rider on an elephant. The elephant is your emotional, intuitive response, massive, powerful, already moving. The rider is your conscious reasoning, small, articulate, and almost entirely occupied with justifying wherever the elephant just decided to go. You are not a thinking machine that sometimes feels. You are a feeling machine that occasionally thinks about it. Which explains a lot, really, about politics, about relationships, about why you've been defending a terrible opinion for 45 minutes in an argument you no longer remember starting. Number 6, you're running about 20 versions of yourself simultaneously. Here's a thought experiment. Think about how you talk to your boss. Now think about how you talk to your best friend. Now your parents. Now a stranger at a checkout line. Now a child. Now someone you find intimidating. Now someone you're trying to impress. Those are not the same person. The vocabulary shifts. The posture changes. The jokes you make, the opinions you volunteer, the amount of space you take up in the conversation, all of it recalibrates automatically without you consciously deciding to do it. And your instinct is probably to call one of those versions the real you and dismiss the rest as performance. But that's not quite right either. Psychologists call this self-monitoring, and it exists on a spectrum. High self-monitors are social chameleons. They read the room fast, adapt quickly, and can seem almost like different people depending on context. Low self-monitors are more consistent across situations, sometimes to the point of social friction. Neither is strictly better. High self-monitors tend to be more socially agile, but sometimes struggle with a stable sense of identity. Low self-monitors know exactly who they are, but occasionally forget that not every room wants the full, unfiltered version of that. But here's what's actually unsettling. The version of you that exists in your own head, the one you think of as you, is just another version. It's the one you construct when you're alone, narrating your own life, building the story of who you are. And that internal narrator is curating. It's selecting the memories that support the self-image, explaining away the ones that don't, and quietly editing the parts that contradict the main character you've decided to be. William James, one of the founders of modern psychology, said a person has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize them. He wrote that in 1890, it took the rest of cognitive science about 100 years to catch up and confirm it with brain scans. So no, you're not fake for being different in different rooms. You're just a full-stack human being running multiple instances at once. The uncomfortable part is accepting that none of them has a stronger claim to being real than the others. Number 5. Your brain hates being wrong more than it loves being right. Imagine you've held a belief for a long time. Maybe it's about a political issue, a person you care about, or a decision you made years ago that your life has since been built around. Now imagine someone hands you clear, well-sourced, completely compelling evidence that you were wrong. a rational system would update. Download the new information, discard the outdated file, move on. Your brain does not do this. Your brain, faced with direct contradiction to a deeply held belief, will often double down. This is called the backfire effect, and while recent research has softened some of the more extreme claims about it, the underlying machinery, motivated reasoning, belief perseverance, identity protective cognition, is very real and very well documented. Here's why. Your beliefs are not stored separately from your sense of self. Over time, the things you believe become part of who you are. So when those beliefs are challenged, your brain doesn't process it as a neutral information update. Processes it as a threat. And the brain responds to social and psychological threats remarkably similarly to how it responds to physical ones. Defensiveness spikes, openness drops, and the goal shifts from finding truth to winning. Leon Festinger studied this in the 1950s by embedding himself with a doomsday cult that predicted the world would end on a specific date. When the date passed and nothing happened, he expected the group to disband. Embarrassed. Instead, many members became more convinced and more evangelical. The discomfort of being wrong, what Festinger called cognitive dissonance, was so unbearable that their brains resolved it by bending reality rather than updating the belief. You've probably done a version of this. Everyone has. The mind doesn't like the feeling of, I was wrong about something important. So it works incredibly hard to avoid ever having to think it. It will reframe evidence, attack the source, find a technicality, or simply refuse to engage. And it does all of this so quickly and so seamlessly that you experience it not as defensiveness, but as clarity. Changing your mind genuinely and completely is one of the hardest things a human brain can do. The people who manage to do it regularly, to actually absorb contradictory information and revise, aren't doing what comes naturally. They're working against a very old, very stubborn default setting, which means intellectual honesty isn't a personality trait. It's a discipline. Number 4. You are constantly, quietly, being shaped by people around you. There's a concept most people accept in theory and almost nobody fully accepts about themselves. You are profoundly, continuously shaped by the people you spend the most time around. Not just in terms of picking up their slang or their taste in music, in terms of your values, your risk tolerance, your ambitions, your definition of what's normal, your baseline for what you deserve. The most cited version of this comes from social psychologist Solomon Asch, whose conformity experiments in the 1950s showed that a significant portion of people will give an answer they know is factually wrong. They can see it's wrong, simply because everyone else in the room said it first. Not because they're spineless. Because the social pain of standing apart from the group activates the same neural circuitry as physical pain. The brain treats exclusion as a survival risk because for most of human history it was. But it goes further than just caving in on obvious questions. Sociologist Nicholas Christakis and political scientist James Fowler spent years mapping how behaviors spread through social networks. Obesity, happiness, smoking cessation, depression, generosity. All of them propagate through friend groups across multiple degrees of separation. Your friend's friend's friend getting divorced slightly increases your own likelihood of divorce. Their happiness nudges yours. Your eating habits influence people you've never met through the chain of people you both know. You're not a sealed system forming opinions in isolation. You are a node in a network, and the network is always transmitting. The version of ambition you have, the level of income you think of as doing okay, the relationship dynamics you consider normal, all of it has been quietly calibrated by proximity. By who was in the room during formative moments. By what the people you admired treated as acceptable. This is not a reason for paranoia. It's a reason for intentionality. Because if social environment shapes you regardless of whether you're paying attention, and it does, then the only question is whether you're choosing environments consciously or just absorbing whatever you happen to be standing next to. Basically, you're always becoming someone. The only variable is whether you noticed you were changing. Number 3. You think you know your future self. You don't. Somewhere in your head lives a future version of you. Maybe they're more disciplined, more organized. They work out consistently, reply to emails promptly, and have somehow figured out what they actually want from life. You make plans on their behalf constantly. You sign them up for things, defer difficult tasks to them, make financial decisions they'll have to live with, and generally treat them like a responsible adult who will handle everything you don't feel like handling right now. The problem is that this future person is essentially a stranger you've assigned enormous responsibility to. Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert spent much of his career studying what he called the end of history illusion, the deeply consistent human tendency to recognize that you've changed a lot in the past 10 years while simultaneously believing you probably won't change much in the next 10. Every age group does this. Teenagers, middle-aged adults, people in their 60s, everyone looks backward and sees transformation, then looks forward and sees stability. And everyone is wrong in the same direction. The version of you that exists in 5 years will have different priorities, different tolerances, different fears, and different definitions of what matters. But you're making commitments now as if you can reliably predict who that person will be. And then you're surprised when you get there and feel no particular connection to the choices past you made. There's also a related glitch called impact bias. Your brain consistently overestimates how strongly future events will affect you emotionally. You think getting that promotion will make you significantly happier for a long time. Research says the effect fades much faster than you expect. You think a bad breakup or a professional failure will devastate you permanently. People adapt faster than they predict. The psychological immune system is quietly doing its job, and you never quite account for it. So the next time you're putting something off because future you will definitely handle it. Future you who is somehow more energetic, more motivated, and in possession of more hours in the day, just know that future you will sit down, feel exactly as human and tired as current you, and wonder why past you left all of this sitting here. Number 2. Your inner monologue is mostly just noise. There's a voice in your head. You're probably hearing it right now, reading these words, adding commentary, half-forming responses, cycling through something vaguely unrelated that popped up for no reason. That voice feels like you, like your real thoughts, your true self, the private channel where honest processing happens. It is mostly chaos wearing a blazer. Psychologist Kross, who wrote an entire book on this internal voice called Chatter, found that the average person spends roughly 30 to 50% of their waking life not engaged with what's actually in front of them, but lost in self-referential mental chatter. Replaying past conversations, pre-running future ones, narrating your own experience while you're having it, criticizing yourself for things that happened 3 years ago at 2 a.m. with the focus and intensity of a federal prosecutor. And here's what makes it worse. That inner voice has a negativity bias baked in. The human brain evolved to rehearse threats, not pleasant afternoons. So left to run unsupervised, your mental monologue will drift toward criticism, anxiety, worst-case scenarios, and social replays, specifically the ones that didn't go well, with a consistency that would be impressive if it weren't so exhausting. Kross also found that one of the most effective ways to get perspective on your own thoughts is to refer to yourself in the third person when you're spiraling. Literally thinking, why is she so worried about this? Instead of, why am I so worried about this, creates enough cognitive distance to reduce emotional reactivity measurably. Which sounds absurd. And works anyway. The inner voice isn't your enemy, and it isn't always wrong. Sometimes it's genuinely processing, problem-solving, or being creative. But a lot of the time, it's just running its mouth. And the first step to not being completely at its mercy is noticing that you are not the voice. You're the one listening to it. Number 1. You are mostly unconscious and absolutely fine with that. Here's the one that pulls the whole rug out. Cognitive scientists estimate that somewhere between 95 and 99% of your brain's activity is happening completely beneath the level of conscious awareness. Not in a sinister Freudian iceberg way, though that metaphor is genuinely apt, but in a deeply mechanical process management way. Your brain is regulating your heartbeat, filtering sensory input, running motor patterns, managing immune response, updating emotional states, scanning social environments, retrieving memories, predicting what will happen next, and doing approximately 10,000 other things right now, and none of it has been submitted to you for review. The conscious mind, the part that feels like you, the part reading the sentence, forming opinions, maybe slightly annoyed, maybe nodding, is more like a highlights reel than a control room. It receives curated summaries of what the rest of the system has already processed and decided. It shows up after most of the work is done and experiences itself as the one who did it. Neuroscientist Benjamin Libet ran experiments in the 1980s showing that the brain's electrical activity associated with a voluntary movement begins nearly half a second before a person is consciously aware of deciding to move. Which means your brain is initiating actions and then informing your conscious self afterward. Your sense of being the one who decided, that feeling of authorship, arrives late like a manager who walks in after the team has already solved the problem and says, "Okay, here's my plan." This has enormous implications for how we think about identity, free will, creativity, and decision-making. But the real gut punch is subtler than any of those. The part of yourself you most identify with, the thinking, choosing, experiencing, narrating you, is the smallest slice of what's actually running. And the vast, humming machinery underneath it has been operating more or less fine without your input this entire time. You are not as in control as you feel. You are not as rational as you believe. You are not as original, as objective, as stable, or as self-aware as the story in your head suggests. And somehow, with all of that being true, here you are, functioning, making choices, having a life, which is either terrifying or genuinely kind of miraculous. Probably both. Mostly both. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.